If you have been wanting to learn how to true a sewing pattern, whether that is a pattern that you've slightly adjusted to fit you better, or a pattern that you've heavily hacked to achieve the silhouette and design details you're after, or maybe even a pattern that you've drafted from scratch, then this video is for you. Truing, or sometimes also spelled truing without the E, is a broad term that describes the process of making sure a pattern is ready to be sewn. And I'm calling it a process on purpose because it isn't just one specific step or thing that you need to check and correct. I would describe it as a series of things that need to be checked and, if necessary, corrected. And the exact steps and things that need to be checked can be completely different depending on the type of garment you're working with, but also the state that the pattern is in, whether it's a rough draft or a finished pattern with just some tiny tweaks. So instead of just telling you to make sure that your corners need to be 90 degrees, to check your seam lengths, or to remind you to create that little hem kick out on a pair of pants, I want to take a slightly different approach in this video by focusing on the why behind it. Because I strongly believe that understanding the context behind it, why something is done a certain way, why it is important, and why it is corrected the way that everyone always tells you to correct it, will help you to apply these things in practice on your own. You'll be able to recognize when these standard rules apply and when they don't. Sometimes your pattern might be an exception to the rule, but it will hopefully also help you to recognize completely different scenarios where these same rules might apply, because you understand the concept behind it and you know what to look out for. But let me be clear, the reason I put the word rules between quotation marks earlier is because I don't want you to feel like these are hard rules that you need to follow. Use this video as a resource and let me meet you where you are, both in the sense of skill level, but also the type of person you are and how you like to work. Because if you're making patterns for yourself, nothing in a professional or commercial setting, you can do whatever you want. It's all up to you whether you feel most comfortable with precision or with approximation. And if you feel like everything I'm discussing in this video are just tiny little things you don't want to fuss about, that's also completely fine, but then this video might not be for you. But if you are interested to learn how to make sure that your patterns fit flawlessly together, how to refine the corners of your seam and hem allowance to make sure they are exactly right, and which corners do and don't need to be exactly 90 degrees, then this video is for you. And you can still decide for yourself if you want to ignore some of these things at certain times or if you want to follow them religiously all the time. Because as I said before, I'll meet you where you are. So if that sounds like you, grab a notebook or pen and paper because I will share everything you need to know about truing patterns. First, we will talk about truing all of the different lines that make up our pattern pieces, looking at their shapes, lengths, and continuity. Next, we'll make sure the pattern is complete. This is the right time to add any remaining pieces or elements that are still missing. We'll dive into the importance of unfolding or mirroring some of our half pattern pieces, and most importantly, a deep dive into allowances, refining the corners of our seam allowance, referencing the order of construction, and how to properly true darts and pleats. At the end, you'll have a solid understanding of all of those little things you need to check or consider for every single pattern piece of the pattern you are working on. You're currently watching part 1, which will cover all of these topics, and all of this will be covered during a second part that is coming soon. So let's get started, shall we? And while you're grabbing that notebook, maybe also grab yourself a nice drink. Because as you can maybe already imagine, this is going to be a long video. In fact, there's something I need to admit. This video has been on my to-do list for 4 months, and I've rewritten the script maybe 5 times already. I honestly lost count. Explaining the why behind truing can quickly get rather technical, abstract, and complex, but I really wanted to translate it into something watchable and easy to understand. Taking the class Writing 101, How to Write an Engaging Video Script on Skillshare, is what finally helped me to refine my messy drafts into the structure I'm currently following to record this video. What I found particularly interesting was the chapter dedicated to scripting for tutorials and how-to videos. So much content online about script writing is aimed at screenwriting or going viral. So finding something that was focused on educational storytelling was exactly what I was after. And I love that Skillshare lets you jump straight to the chapter you're after. This way you can decide for each class whether you want to follow it from the start or jump ahead. Skillshare has creative classes on so many topics beyond scripting. I've already bookmarked a few on video editing, and I'm curious to check out some of their pattern making classes too, mostly to see what the level is like and whether there are any I would actually recommend to you. Skillshare is the best place to learn a new skill or pick up a new hobby. If you're looking to reconnect with your creativity and maybe avoid brain rot, Skillshare is the place where humans come to learn from other humans. The first 500 people to use my link in the description or scan the QR code will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So check it out, and thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Alright, before we dive into the actual truing process, I want to make sure we're on the same page about a couple of things. Because getting these right from the start will make everything that follows go a lot smoother. The first thing I want to address is what actually needs to be trued. In many cases, the answer is very simple: everything. If you've drafted a pattern from scratch, traced a draft using a system like Letterlow, digitized a paper pattern, or hacked and adjusted a commercial sewing pattern until it's barely recognizable anymore, in all of those situations, I would check everything and correct where needed. But if you've only made a couple of small adjustments to a commercial sewing pattern that was already properly trued, you don't need to go through everything, of course. In that case, the answer to our question becomes everything that hasn't been trued before or that has been adjusted again after truing. A quick example to make that more concrete. If you shorten the legs on a pair of pants, there's no need to re-true the waistband or pocket pieces. But if you adjusted these pants in the ratio between the waist and hips, you do need to revisit the waistband and pockets, but now the inseam can be left alone. Think about which pieces were actually affected by your changes and start there. Next, I quickly want to cover the anatomy of a pattern piece, specifically the difference between the seam line and the cut line, because I'll be referring to both during this video and I want to make sure we're speaking the same language. The seam line, sometimes also called the sew line or stitching line, is the line where two pieces will actually be sewn together. The cut line is the outer edge of the seam allowance, the line you follow while cutting your fabric. So in a finished garment, this is the seam line, the ditch of the seam, and the cut line can be found on the inside of the garment. It's the edge of the seam allowances, which is hopefully enclosed by some kind of finish, overlock, binding, or folded away into the seam. If your pattern shows two parallel lines, the inner one is almost always the seam line and the outer one is the cut line. I won't get into those exceptions because they are truly rare, but you can think about pattern pieces that have a hole in the middle. Does your pattern only show one line and you're not sure which one you're looking at? If the pattern states that the seam allowance is included, you're looking at the cut line, and the seam line runs on the inside. If no seam allowance is included, you're looking at the seam line, and you can choose your own seam allowance. After adding that, on the outside, you will have your cut line. The reason this matters for truing is because the majority of steps are focused on the seam line, because that is the line where your pieces will actually be joined. So if possible, I would strongly recommend starting the process of truing before adding your seam allowance. So if you don't have seam allowance yet, because you're self-drafting using a system like Lutterlow or a commercial pattern like Burda, where you need to add your own, that's great. Keep it that way for now and add it after truing your pieces. If you're working with a commercial pattern that already has the seam allowance included, there's no need to remove it. But I would recommend drawing in the seam line on your pattern pieces in those areas that you need to true for easier reference. You can do this by simply marking parallel lines at the depth of the seam allowance, or if you can't be bothered to draw along all of the edges, at the very least I would mark the intersections of the seam line in each corner. That way you always know exactly where a seam starts and ends for accurate measuring and comparing. The last thing I want to cover before we start is the order in which you work through your pattern pieces, because working in the right order will save you a lot of back and forth. I find it helpful to think about my pattern pieces in terms of how they relate to each other. As far as I know, there aren't any official categories or subgroups that describe this, but the way I think about it, you could distinguish three types. Primary pieces are the foundational ones, the pieces that define the overall shape and fit of the garment. Think front and back panels, sleeves, pant legs. These are often the bigger pieces of a pattern and the pieces you true first. Secondary pieces are the supporting ones, and their shape is dependent on the primary pieces. Think of facings, linings, integrated pockets. Any change you make to a primary piece needs to be reflected in the secondary pieces that are either directly derived from it or that are just closely connected to it. And some patterns might have a few pieces that fall into the category of standalone pieces. Things like patch pockets, sleeve plackets, or narrow straps or ties, which can really be any shape or size without affecting the truing process or the dimensions of the pieces they are attached to. These are often also completely interchangeable between different patterns. They can therefore be trued at any point in time, so I usually tackle them at the very end or whenever it's convenient. But it really doesn't matter which exact categories you divide all of your pieces into, or if you divide them at all. You don't have to. But I would encourage you to think about the relationship between your pattern pieces in a similar way, because you can use that to figure out the order that makes most sense to you and the pattern you are working on. Now that we know which pieces we are working with and in which order we're going to do that, it's time for the actual truing, checking all of the lines that make up our pattern pieces. I've divided this into 3 things we're looking at: the shape of each individual line, the lengths of edges that will be sewn together, and the continuity of lines going across seams. In practice, these 3 overlap constantly. When you put a front and back panel together along the shoulder seam, you can check the length of that seam and the continuity of the neckline and the armhole all in one go. So don't think of these as 3 different steps that happen in isolation or in a strict sequence. Think of them as 3 lenses you are applying, often simultaneously. I'll try to explain them one by one so each concept is clear. But once you start working on your own pattern, you will naturally start combining them. Let's start with the shape of each individual line, meaning the path of a single edge on a single piece before you even bring another piece into the picture. Some lines should be perfectly straight. If you know a line is supposed to be straight, but you notice it isn't, maybe you picked up a slight wobble or it shifted slightly while you were tracing it, the fix is simple: straighten it out. Common examples of lines that are typically straight include the center front and center back edges, rectangular pieces like plackets or cuffs, or the side seams of voluminous gathered skirts. Shoulder seams and hemlines can be straight too, but they don't have to be. So always consider what's correct for the specific garment you're working on. For curved lines, other than making sure that they align with the other panel they will be sewn to, it's harder to give universal advice. The right curve of a line depends heavily on the garment, the design, the size, and very importantly, the fit. For apparel patterns, my best advice here is to get familiar with the shapes that work well for your body, so you can recognize when a curve might need some refining. The more patterns you work with, the more that instinct develops. For some non-apparel patterns like bags or other accessories, curves can sometimes be verified and corrected mathematically. This is the case for pieces where the shape follows a very precise geometric logic, something very regular, symmetric, or just mathematically predictable in shape. To give you an example, for a freelance pattern making project I was working on this past month, I was asked to true the pattern pieces for a hat before grading and virtual prototyping. And I ended up truing most of those pattern pieces mathematically. Instead of manually tweaking the curve of this piece, I calculated the exact curvature that was needed for this piece, so it would fit perfectly between these 2 oval shapes. In geometric terms, this would be considered creating a flat pattern for an oval-shaped conical frustum. And yes, I definitely had to look up the English translation for that term, because as a Dutchie, I would call that shape een afgeknotte kegel. Anyways, this is of course a very niche and technical application of truing, and I assume that most of you are probably here for apparel patterns, where geometric calculations are rarely useful. But I wanted to touch upon it very quickly, because technically it does still fall under the umbrella of truing the shape of a line. Next, we check line lengths, making sure that 2 edges that will be sewn together are actually the same length. And a quick but important reminder before we start, we're comparing seam lines here, not the cut lines. There are 2 ways to compare lengths: physically placing the pieces against each other, or measuring each line separately and comparing the numbers. If I'm measuring, I always like to write the measurements down on the paper pattern as I go, so I don't have to remeasure later. But the majority of times, you'll find me comparing the edges physically like this. For straight edges, either method is straightforward. For measuring, you can use a hard ruler or a measuring tape, and I assume I don't need to explain how to use those. To compare them physically, you can simply align the edges against each other like this, if the pieces don't have seam allowance. If your pattern pieces do already have seam allowance included, you can either fold the allowance away or overlap the pieces so that the seam lines are exactly on top of each other. Slightly transparent pattern paper is very helpful for that. Curved edges need a bit more work, but there are a few small tricks to make it easier. When measuring, it's easiest to use a flexible measuring tape, which you use on its side, vertically, for the most accurate results. For comparing them physically, you could cut into the seam allowance a few times like this, to fold it out of the way, but overlapping them is usually the most reliable approach to compare curved lines. This technique is called walking a pattern, or simply walking edges, because you slowly walk with one piece along the seam allowance of the other piece, constantly aligning a small section at a time, bit by bit. And something to keep in mind here, when comparing curves, it's not necessary to keep both of your pieces with the right sides facing up at all times. It's completely fine, and I would even recommend it, to flip one of the pieces with the right side facing down sometimes, if that makes the edges curve in the same direction. It's so much easier to compare them this way. Don't flip them like this though. Always keep the top and bottom of the seam on the same side, but as long as you keep that direction the same, right side up or right side down doesn't make a difference. Don't forget to also check your notches while comparing line lengths. And they are also very handy to use as checkpoints. You can check each section between two notches separately, so you don't need to walk an entire seam in one go, which also makes it much easier to pinpoint exactly where a discrepancy is located if you come to find any difference in the lengths of your seam lines. If the length matches between most pairs of notches, but not between one specific pair, that's where you need to true it. For seams with a dart or pleat on one of the two pieces, you can essentially skip over the dart or pleat while checking the length. You can simply align the edges until one side of the dart, add a small mark, move the piece over until this mark meets the other side of the dart, and then you continue until the end. And one more thing you shouldn't forget, also check the length of the dart legs. Some darts don't need much truing here, but if a lot of adjustments happened in the area around the dart, it can definitely use some extra attention in truing. And for any bus darts, double check that the tip of the dart ends just before the apex, not right on top. This part of the dart also needs truing, but we'll cover that during part 2 of this video in a specific section dedicated to dart allowance. Now, an important thing to keep in mind, not every difference in lengths is a mistake. Some edges are intentionally different lengths, where the longer one is supposed to be eased into the shorter one. Some common examples are the back shoulder seam is sometimes slightly longer than the front to create room for the natural curve of the shoulder after easing it in. The sleeve head very often has ease built in, especially in more structured sleeves or tailored garments. In close-fitting jeans, the back inseam might be intentionally shorter than the front. The back is then supposed to be stretched into the front while sewing, which pulls the fabric ever so slightly up under the bum to reduce bunching at the back thigh. If you find a mismatch and you're not sure whether to correct it or not, the first thing I'd recommend is to see if you can figure out where the discrepancy is coming from. Retracing your steps can sometimes help to reveal a mistake you made earlier. And after correcting it at the source, the mismatch disappears entirely. If it's in an area that you haven't really adjusted much and it's a commercial pattern by a pattern maker you trust, I would assume it's intentional ease. You can also try to imagine what would happen if you left it and eased in the difference. With the resulting shape makes sense for where the seam sits on the body. Google, Threadloop, Reddit, and other online sewing communities can also be incredibly helpful if you need a second opinion on whether to remove or maintain any ease in a specific seam. And if you're still unsure after considering all of these things, I would just make them even. When in doubt, even it out. So how do we do that? If you can identify where along the seam the discrepancy is, adjust in that specific area rather than spreading it across a section that was already matching. You don't want to shift pieces into more misalignment. If you don't have enough notches to pinpoint exactly where an issue might have come from, you can consider if you have a preference for which side to correct it on. Maybe you don't mind making the armholes slightly larger or slightly smaller, or maybe you already know that you want to crop the garment slightly. Measuring a similar pattern you already own, or even finished garments from your wardrobe, can sometimes also give you a useful reference point to work with. Deciding where and how to correct any differences is completely up to you, and depending on the type of garment you're working on. You can shorten the longer edge, lengthen the shorter one, or a bit of both. If you just don't have any strong preferences either way, or if the length difference is on the larger side, something like 1 to 1.5 centimeters or more, I'd recommend splitting the difference as evenly as possible. Place the pieces so half the difference falls on each side, then redraw both edges through the center of the difference. This way, you're distributing the adjustment across 4 small corrections rather than making one big change in a single spot, which keeps the lines balanced and avoids throwing off the shape. And one more note before we move on. I very often hear, that's such a small difference, I'll just ease that in while sewing. You can absolutely do that. If that works for you, that's completely fine. I'm not trying to tell you that everything should be exactly perfectly correct, but I am here to tell you how to do that if that is the thing that you want to achieve. And my personal take is that if a difference is not intentional, I don't want it to exist in my pattern. I know I can ease it in while sewing, but I'd rather save my easing for things that are meant to be eased, like the examples we talked about earlier, or for the tiny inconsistencies that come from cutting or sewing something 1 or 2 millimeters off, not for something that I easily could have corrected on paper beforehand. So that is something that everyone should figure out for themselves. Which level of precision or approximation are you comfortable with? Pick your battles, or let the type of garment or fabric guide how much precision this particular seam needs. The last thing that we need to talk about is line continuity, making sure that when two edges are sewn together, the neighboring lines form a smooth, uninterrupted join at that intersection. You may have heard the advice to make sure that your corners are 90 degrees. That's true for many corners, but not all of them. So let's chat about the logic. Let's start with a classic example, the corner between the center front and the hemline on the front panel of a shirt. If we were to mirror this pattern piece along the center front, we can mimic what the hem will look like after this shirt is fully constructed. If that corner is not a right angle, so 90 degrees, the hemline won't be smooth. If the angle is too small, the hem will peak outward or downwards. And if it is too big, it will dip inward or upwards. And the same principle applies anywhere where the end of a seam meets another piece. A side seam joining a waistband, or also a yoke seam meeting the center front on a denim jacket. If the angle isn't 90 degrees, the fabric will either poke out or pull inward at that point instead of laying flat. So generally speaking, we indeed want to make sure that these corners are 90 degrees. But in my opinion, that's not the rule you should remember. Rather than thinking about it as a 90-degree rule, I think it's more effective to think of it as a 180-degree rule. Let me explain this 180 rule with the help of a quick visualization again and some basic geometry. So you have the full logic and not just another rule to memorize. Usually we associate the word angle with something that looks like this. The angle of this corner is 90 degrees, which we also call a right angle. We can now rotate this line. When the angle gets smaller, the corner becomes sharper. Right now it's about 45 degrees. In geometry, everything between 0 and 90 degrees is called an acute angle. If we then rotate it in the opposite direction, the angle becomes bigger and the corner becomes less sharp. Corners between 90 and 180 degrees are called obtuse angles. If we keep rotating it until it is exactly in line with the other half, it forms a perfectly straight line. But it's also still an angle. Right now, we've got ourselves a 180-degree angle, also called a straight angle. If we then go back to the context of garments and their patterns, let's zoom in on the hemline of our shirt. And in the middle, we have our center front running vertically. And over here, we have the bottom two corners of our front panels. The corner of each front panel is 90 degrees, and together they add up to 180 degrees. Technically, the result of the 90-degree rule and the 180-degree rule is the same. 90 plus 90 is 180. But the main difference is that the 180 rule is more versatile. It applies to all of those corners that would fall under the 90-degree rule, but it also covers a lot of exceptions, where the corners are not 90 degrees each, yet together they still add up to 180 degrees. Take the high shoulder point, for example, where the front and back panels meet at the top of the shoulder seam. We want the neckline to flow smoothly from the front curve into the back curve. The exact shape depends on the style of the neckline that you're after, of course, but it's not uncommon for these corners to not be 90 degrees. For close-fitting necklines, this curve can be drafted to come in at a slight angle here at the shoulder seam, rather than straight on with a 90-degree angle, which is done on purpose to mimic the natural shape and typical anatomy of the shoulder as closely as possible, like drawn out here in this pattern making book. So neither corner is 90 degrees individually, but together they still add up to 180, and as a result, the neckline curves smoothly. The other end of these necklines, where the neckline meets the center front or the center back, is one of our typical 90-degree examples again. I always like to draw a short guideline at 90 degrees to use it as a reference for my curve. Coming in too high like this would result in a subtle V shape, and drawing our curve too low, dipping below that 90-degree guideline, would result in a little peak like this. So to ensure a smooth transition between left and right, we make sure to come in and blend into our 90-degree guideline just before that center front. And I also want to flag something here that used to confuse me a bit when I was learning these rules in fashion school, because those 90 and 180-degree angles don't always look like sharp geometric shapes, especially not on curved edges like the neckline, armhole, or a sleeve cap. A 90-degree corner on a curved line simply means that the curve starts out at 90 degrees, just for that first little bit of 1 or maybe just half a centimeter, and then it can curve away. A smooth curve is essentially a continuous series of 180-degree angles. If any of you are familiar with vector drawing tools like Adobe Illustrator, Inkscape, or Clo 3D, this is exactly what curve handles do when they are set to smooth. Rotating one handle automatically rotates the other to ensure that 180-degree relationship between them. But don't worry, in practice you don't need to measure every single curve of your pattern piece. I rarely measure as in read out the exact angle of a corner. The reason I'm explaining this in depth is not to make you measure the angle of every single corner. It's so you understand why you're checking what you're checking, and so you can reason your way through a correction when something looks off. In practice, checking line continuity is simple. Place the relevant edges next to each other and check whether the neighboring lines continue smoothly. That's it. For straight edges, you can often check it in one go while checking the length of the seam. For curved edges, just focus on aligning those first few centimeters at the end of the seam. You want to get as close as possible to how these pieces would align right over here when sewn together, so you don't need to worry about the lines curving in opposite directions over there. Distribute any length differences evenly, like I explained before, to true the length and continuity in one go. Or if the lengths are already matching, but they just don't flow smoothly yet, you can simply redraw the curve or smoothen it out as needed. You can use a set square to verify and to draw your guidelines for those corners that need to be 90 degrees. If you don't have a set square, the corner of any sheet of paper or the corner of a table also works perfectly fine. There's no exact science here or an approach that works for every single pattern or situation. But if the lengths are already matching and I don't want to make any adjustments there, I always stick to the original intersection point. That's where I draw my guideline and where I make sure that my new curves blend in nicely. And if your pattern pieces already have seam lines included and you're making any adjustments at the seam line, I'd recommend to make the same adjustment on the cut line right away as well, or mark the affected area very clearly in the seam allowance so you don't forget to update it later. Because for small adjustments, it's easy to forget. But if you don't update that cut line, your adjustment will have been for nothing. Now to wrap it up over here, truing the shapes, lengths, and continuity are clearly not individual steps that happen in isolation. Everything is connected and many things can be checked and corrected in one go. Ideally, most corrections are minor, subtle redraws rather than major interventions, but that's of course totally dependent on the state that the pattern is in. It's a matter of practice and learning to trust your eye. If something looks smooth and flows naturally, it probably is. And if something feels a little bit off, it probably won't hurt to give a little nudge. And that's where we'll leave it off for today. In this first part, we've covered everything you need to know about truing all of those edges and curves of your primary pattern pieces. In part 2 of this video, we'll pick up right where we left off, taking those trued primary pieces and making the pattern complete. I'll talk about the importance of unfolding half pattern pieces, and then we'll talk about a part of truing that's rarely talked about, what happens after adding our seam allowance, refining the corners of our cut lines, creating that subtle kick out of the hem, and how to properly true your darts and pleats. Part 2 is already in the works, so if you don't want to miss it when it goes live, you know where to find the subscribe button. And in the meantime, I'd love to know if the entire process of truing like this was already part of your workflow, or if this video has introduced you to some new steps that you'll be taking into account next time you're working on a pattern. And if you're running into any specific challenges with truing your own patterns, you can also use the comments to ask questions or help each other out. And if you found this video to be useful, there is a Ko-fi link in the description. Always appreciate it, but never expect it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in part 2.